there's this guy in my home state, Vermont, who feels like he's always just been around. And when I say around, I mean like everywhere. Rural parts of the state, citified parts of the state, stages and record shops, fancy restaurants and dive bars. He seems to always just be there. And I can't quite tell if that's because he's actually out and about that often, or if it's because he's the kind of guy you can't miss. He dresses in tall hats, thick, colorful scarves, round glasses, statement jewelry, and carries a massive bass clarinet with him. It's not subtle, and he'll often play it as accompaniment to his poetry. He's a musician. He's a poet. And after a single conversation with him, I've also concluded that he is a poem himself.
Brothers and brothers, brothers and brothers, brothers and brothers, brothers and brothers in arms of other brothers, brothers and brothers, brothers and brothers, loving brothers in arms of other brothers, loving brothers, brothers and brothers.
One night at a dive bar in the state's capital, I found myself bellied up to the bar sitting next to this man who I'd seen for so long but knew so little about. So we got to know each other better, more deeply and with more intention. And then I did it. I asked him for an interview so that you could get to know him too. He's worth knowing. Meet Toussaint St. Negritude. Even his name is poetic. He should know. He chose it.
Thank you so much for referring to it as poetic. It gives me chills of joy to hear that, because that's it. I'm a poet. It's pronounced. I pronounce it as my mother always did growing up, Toussaint, and the correct French is Toussaint, and the final T is silent. But my mother, being from the South, is Toussaint, and the final T is pronounced, and it definitely comes from the Haitian leader of their revolution against the French. And negritude in French, negritude is like literally blackness, and so it's their movement to embrace their blackness. The saint refers to the spiritual aspect through voodoo and other African spiritual traditions that are part of the culture, that are part of every artistic endeavor. And I just felt that as people of African descent, we don't often hear ourselves referred to with any spiritual reverence. We know of St. Michael, St. Peter, these white gods or white saints. But I look forward to the day when there's St. Nina, St. Langston. It's always been kind of a silent thrill, when I'm working for major institutions where I'm the only BIPOC person within 50 miles of the building, and people who aren't particularly pro-Black. Every time they utter my name, they're uttering pro-Blackness, and I like that. I may not be able to own my means of income, working for someone else, may not be able to own the place where I live. In the society, there's so much. I might not even own the clothes on my back, but it was important for me to own my poetry, to own my creativity, and most of all, to own my name. My name.
From Vermont Public, this is Homegoings. I'm Myra Flynn. Today on the show, a conversation with Toussaint Negritude, poet laureate in Maine, nominee for Vermont, teacher, son, and lover, about his joyful nostalgia of being out and gay in the 1970s.
I felt like Black queer life was much more out. It was much more visible. Everybody knew.
This is Homegoings. We're a proud member of the NPR network. Welcome home. Toussaint's name wasn't always Toussaint. Is your given name considered a dead name to you now? What was that name and where'd it go?
It is considered a dead name to me now. I'm not really mad at the name, but I am Toussaint. That's who I am. And growing up, and maybe particularly my generation, I'm 65, so my elementary school years were in the 60s, where our rights were still in a transitional period, and of course they're still transitioning now. And it was just always very alarming to me from my earliest ages of how, as Black people, we don't own anything of ourselves. We were constantly in a state of someone else's ownership. And, when I became 16 and learning how to drive, and the whole goal was to get the driver's license, I was kind of a radical teenager, which was in the 70s. And I hate it. I hated the whole notion that the government had to certify my identity. I really rebelled against that. In high school, for the pictures for the high school yearbook, it's funny to think back on it now, but I refused to wear a tuxedo because I associate it, and nowadays, I own 3 tuxedos, but I associated tuxedos with colonization and all of that. And, I had an afro, and my mother was making dashikis, and I didn't, I was a really rebellious teenager. And when I became Toussaint St. Negritude, which is really just me all along, it was really important for me to own my name. Don't laugh, but my father was a radio announcer and an actor. He was an actor before I was born, and a radio announcer my whole life, and his name was James Titus, and a very proud Northern Black man from the school of, as if Northern was better than Southern. That was kind of his thinking. My mother is a much more fiercely proud Black Alabaman. It's always so interesting. My father grew up in Ohio, and very proudly thought of him as like a cut above as a Northern Negro. But he grew up urban poor, whereas my mother grew up pretty comfortable in the segregated Black South. But so my father named me after Orson Welles. I was born in 59, so kind of just thinking of the mindset of 59. Orson Welles, Gregory Peck. So he named me Orson Gregory Titus. I was always furious. I was like, You couldn't have named me Malcolm. Okay, maybe that's too much to ask. You couldn't have named me Langston, Paul Lawrence Dunbar. There are so many beautiful black names. And at one point, I asked my father about it years later, and he said, "Well, you were so dark skinned, which, is like 12 X's against you." He thought by giving me the whitest sounding name that perhaps it would help me. And of course, that explanation like furthered my disdain for my father's judgment.
You did a complete backflip and named yourself the blackest name that you could think of. I'm starting to hear this rebellious streak in you. It's almost like you have some inner voice that frees you. And I am very curious where that comes from because so many of us culturally as Black folks have an inside voice that says, how dare you? How dare you think that you can? How dare you think you can be anything you want, love anyone you want, create anything that you want? And at 65 years old, I am curious, like how dare you? How dare you, Toussaint?
I feel like there's been a divine guidance since I was a child that early on somehow like sent me the message that given all the hatred in the world, within all communities, within the Black community, given the homophobia and all the biases of the world, that my greatest protection, since I never really knew how to physically fight, and I was always too squeamish to like do anything violent, that my greatest protection would be being myself. The period that I came of age in during the 70s, that was it. The elders that were around me who were like my mentors, Sly Stone, Sylvester, classic Sylvester. It was all about pushing the envelope. Don't wait for society to approve you or permit you. Claim your fabulousness yourself. And when you really understand that, well, who else? Like, of course you should claim your fabulousness immediately. And teaching poetry classes to high school students, that's one of the first things that I really try to drum in their heads and throughout the experience of, if you're looking for authorization, I, Holy Toussaint, authorize you to claim yourself right now. Do it right now. Absolutely right now. That's just been a constant drum in my head, a reminder of how beautiful we are, and the queer aspect of it, the gay aspect of it, cranks it up like 12 more notches.
Bravery is called bravery for a reason because the stakes are high, right? You are 65 years old. You're from a generation where in white culture, being queer and gay was not acceptable. In Black culture, it definitely wasn't acceptable. So I guess my big question is, did your bravery ever backfire?
I've been tremendously blessed. Um, no, and I'm grateful for that. Um, Extremely grateful. I have a cousin. Unfortunately, had a cousin who was just a few years older than me, but kind of in my generation, who was born and raised in Alabama, outside of Birmingham, never left, and was the only other out gay man in the family that I knew of. And maybe about 7 years ago, uh, was found. I hate to cut to the chase, but was found dead on a sidewalk. Someone had slit his throat and lacerated his entire body. Heinous, straight up homophobic crime. And I remember when that happened, there were several, on the long list of queer people who were killed, homophobically killed. There was this trend of like cutting their throats, cutting our throats. And of course, as a poet, I couldn't help but think, they literally want to like cut our voices, cut our throats. George Floyd, I can't breathe. They literally want to like cut or choke our throats, which is so heavy to think about. And of course, I have constantly, repeatedly thanked my mother. My mother's 88 and thankfully still here. I've constantly thanked her for getting out of Alabama. It was always clear to me that as a gay man, a black gay man, that could have easily been my fate.
When we come back, Toussaint speaks to that beauty and fierceness as a survival tool for Black queer men like himself.
The more extreme um, deliveries of homophobia within the black community seem more recent to me. When I was growing up, um, I felt like black queer life was much more out. It was much more visible. Everybody knew, you know, even in places that were Baptist, fire and brimstone. When you went to the most Baptist church, it was a given. You knew that the choir director was, of course, a gay man. You know, 90% of the choir was gay, and everybody knew this. There was no mystery. They were clearly the best dressed people in the church, the most articulate, and I'm dead serious in saying this, and the most skilled. And if you were putting a choir together or looking for a choir director, you're not going to pick Joe Straight Guy, the football player. You're going to pick, and I don't mean to be heterophobic in saying that, but you're definitely going to look for a queer person because, particularly within the black community and certainly within the black queer community, we were the ones with the flavor. Back in the day, when, like, during the 70s, Soul Train, and, there was always a new dance that if you were hip, that you had to know. Everybody had to know whatever the new dance was, and whether it was a funky chicken or whatever the dance was. And the first people who knew those dances were queer people. We were the arbiters, and this is no joke. We were the arbiters of style, of education, of hipness. We were the first ones who were using certain catchphrases because it was too scandalous for upstanding straight people to use those phrases. So, in my upbringing, there was always a space within the queer community. Yes, it was a segregated space, but there was a space held for Black queer life. And we really preferred our queer space, our Black queer space. I don't think we saw it as segregated. It was like it was a cool space. If you were invited to a party and the party was being thrown by someone in the Black queer community, you knew you were going to have a good time.
I love hearing actually somebody talk about like the beauty of a space and time, because I have no clue, just as an ally myself, have absolutely no clue what that looks like for folks. I keep seeing my LGBTQIA community and friends having to fight for that space and that community. And so to just like harken back to a time, I don't know why I'm picturing disco music in my head. I'm just picturing it as like a really beautiful scene. It's lovely to hear that it's not all tragedy, because there was a lot of the notion of like, because of things like slavery, you can't be perceived as soft and loving and artistic and poetic and, maybe even hip and cool in these very artful ways, because, we don't have like the luxury to be seen as softer. I mean, we still don't have the luxury to be seen as softer. So I always just think it's extra brave, or there must be some other hurdle of survival that Black gay men have had to overcome.
Yes. I absolutely hear you, and I think that certainly might have been true for some, but in the larger Black gay community, it was the opposite of soft. It was, can I cuss a little bit?
If you do not cuss on Homegoings, I don't even know what Homegoings is. Yes.
Well, just thinking about all that, thinking of the homophobia in the situation, as Black queer people, we had to whoop ass. We had to defend ourselves. We didn't have time to be soft. And when you think of like Little Richard, flaming Black gay man, as early as the 1940s, coming out of the South, there was nothing soft about Little Richard. Little Richard will cuss your ass out.
And now, the one, the only, Little Richard!
Happy birthday, baby. I'm in my 50s too. I know how I feel. Shut up!
One of the first words I learned in Black gay life was the word fierce, which was a compliment. And it was a compliment to be fierce, not soft, but fierce. So, yeah, I kind of want to, counter this notion of us being soft, but then at the same time, I still want to welcome it. I've always kind of resented that as Black people, generally, beyond sexuality, we've always had to be so on guard all the time. In the grocery store, picking out apples, we have to be on guard, like so on guard. In our beloved churches, we have to be so on guard. There's not, not a soft moment. And I get it. I totally understand it. Unfortunately, we do have to be on guard. But we also deserve our sweetness.
I love this. I got to say, I did not expect this to be such a joyful conversation.
I've really had to kind of carry my love with me, like in my chest, constantly, just like a constant mantra. I'm sure that there's some white friends I have on Facebook here in Vermont that are so sick of all the beautiful Black things I post on my Facebook page. But it's just a reminder to both me and them that, here it is. This is Black joy. And I'm adamant about sharing that Black joy because you don't see it anywhere else. We have to shine our light always. And, I know nowadays it's really kind of popular to make this distinction between thriving and surviving and kind of putting down survival. Survival for us has been thriving. And we are the descendants of those who made it. We're the descendants of those that didn't die on the first day of enslavement, as was totally understandable if they did die. We're the ones whose ancestors were so cunning, so smart, as to survive, mentally, spiritually, and physically. So we're the cream of the crop. Okay?
Toussaint St. Negritude, thank you for sharing yourself, all of yourself, here on Homegoings. Also, thank you for joining us. I reported and mixed this episode and also composed our theme music. Woo! I've been busy. All other music by Blue Dot Sessions. Aaron Edwards is our new editor on the show. Hey, Aaron. And James Stewart, our associate producer, is responsible for so much of the awesome that happens behind the scenes here on the show. Elodie Reed created the graphic for this episode, so head on over to homegoings.co to check out Toussaint reveling in some serious sweetness. Remember that Homegoings has moved over to YouTube, so check out our channel there and be sure to subscribe. While you're at it, subscribe to all our other stuff like our newsletter and give us a follow on Instagram at We Are Homegoings. If you have thoughts, reflections, or asks of me as your host about who we should talk to or what we should explore next on the show, write to me at hey@homegoings.co. As always, you are welcome here.